9 months after Hiroshima, the President of the United States sat down and wrote a short memo to Dean Acheson, the Under-Secretary of State. In it, he called the most famous scientist in America a crybaby. He said he never wanted to see him again. The scientist had come to the White House, shaken the president's hand, and told him he felt he had blood on his hands. The president would not forget that sentence. The story did not end at the White House. Julius Robert Oppenheimer was born in New York City on April 22, 1904. His father, Julius, had come from Hanau, in Germany, as a teenager in 1888, with no English and no money, and built a fortune importing textiles. His mother, Ella, was a painter. The family lived on Riverside Drive, in an apartment with Van Goghs on the walls. Robert was a strange, delicate child. He collected minerals. At 11, he was elected to the New York Mineralogical Club. The other members assumed from his letters that he was an adult. He read Greek. Years later, in his Berkeley years, he would learn Sanskrit. He was precise, intense, and by his own admission, not very happy. He went to Harvard in 1922. He studied chemistry, then drifted toward physics, the science that was in those years, rebuilding itself from the ground up. He finished in 3 years, graduated summa cum laude, and sailed for England. Cambridge in 1925 was the center of the physics world. Oppenheimer went to the Cavendish laboratory to work under Patrick Blackett. He was miserable there. He was clumsy with equipment. He was a theorist, trying to be an experimentalist and failing. According to a story he told later, and which his biographers describe as disputed in its details, he left a poisoned apple on Blackett's desk. The apple was never eaten. The university, according to the same account, came close to expelling him. He moved to Göttingen in Germany, where the real revolution was happening. Quantum mechanics was being invented in real time by people in their 20s. Oppenheimer took his PhD there in March 1927 under Max Born. He was 22. He turned 23 the following month. He came home to a country that had almost no theoretical physics. In 1929, he took a joint position at Berkeley and Caltech. For the next decade, he built, almost single-handedly, an American school of theoretical physics. Students followed him from one campus to the other. They mimicked his mannerisms. They called him Oppie. His own research was wide and restless. He worked on quantum electrodynamics. He worked on cosmic rays. In 1939, with his student Hartland Snyder, he published a paper on what happens when a very massive star runs out of fuel and collapses under its own gravity. The paper described in effect what we now call a black hole. It was ignored for decades. It appeared in the same issue of Physical Review as a paper by Niels Bohr and John Wheeler on nuclear fission. That fission paper mattered more in the short run, because in 1938 in Berlin, 2 chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, split the uranium atom. 2 physicists, Lise Meitner, a refugee in Sweden, and her nephew Otto Frisch, working at Bohr's Institute in Copenhagen, met for Christmas and worked out what had actually happened. By 1942, the United States was at war, and a general named Leslie Groves was looking for a scientist to run a laboratory that did not yet exist. Groves picked Oppenheimer. It was, on paper, a strange choice. Oppenheimer had never managed anything larger than a graduate seminar. He had no Nobel Prize. He had left-wing friends, a communist brother, and a former fiancée, Jean Tatlock, who was a Communist Party member. The FBI had a file on him. Groves overruled every objection. Groves later said he picked Oppenheimer because, more than anyone, Oppenheimer wanted the job. The laboratory was built on a mesa in northern New Mexico, on the site of a boys' school called the Los Alamos Ranch School. Oppenheimer had ridden horses in that country as a young man, on a pack trip in 1922. He chose the site himself. By the end of the war, the town held close to 8,000 people: physicists, chemists, engineers, soldiers, wives, children. All of them behind a fence, all of them working on the same problem. The problem was this: The nucleus of a uranium or plutonium atom, when hit by a neutron, can split in two, releasing a little energy and 2 or 3 more neutrons. Those neutrons can split more atoms. If you have enough of the right material, packed tightly enough, the reaction runs away in a fraction of a second. The energy released by a kilogram of it is roughly equal to the energy released by 20,000 tons of TNT. The question at Los Alamos was not whether it would work. The question was how to build a device, small enough to drop from an airplane, that would make it work reliably. That took 3 years, $2 billion, around 35 billion in today's money, and the largest concentration of scientific talent ever assembled. At 5:29 in the morning on July 16, 1945, in the desert south of Los Alamos, the device worked. The test was called Trinity. The yield was about 21 kilotons. A mountain range 100 miles away was briefly lit as if by a second sun. Oppenheimer later said that, watching the cloud rise, he thought of a line from the Bhagavad Gita, the scripture he had learned to read in Sanskrit. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He said this for the camera in 1965. It is not clear whether he thought the line at the time or only later. His brother Frank, who stood beside him that morning, remembered only that Robert said, "It worked." 3 weeks later, the bombs were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At Hiroshima, at least 90,000 people died, and possibly more than 140,000 once radiation injuries are counted. Around 70,000 died at Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. Oppenheimer became overnight the most famous scientist in America. He was not happy about it. In October 1945, he met President Truman at the White House. By multiple accounts, Truman's own 1946 memo to Dean Acheson, David Lilienthal's diary, Acheson's papers, Oppenheimer told Truman he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman afterwards wrote that he never wanted to see that crybaby scientist again. For the next few years, Oppenheimer chaired the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission. He argued against an immediate crash program to build a hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the one he had built. He made enemies. Among them was Louis Strauss, a commissioner whom Oppenheimer had once publicly humiliated in a congressional hearing in 1949 over whether to export radioactive isotopes to Allied research labs. Strauss thought it was a national security matter. Oppenheimer made him look foolish on the record. Strauss did not forget. In 1953, Strauss became chairman of the AEC. In December, Oppenheimer was told his security clearance was being suspended. The hearing ran for roughly 4 weeks in the spring of 1954, in a small building in Washington. Witnesses came in. His old left-wing associations were dragged out. His fellow physicist, Edward Teller, asked whether he trusted Oppenheimer, gave a careful, damaging answer, that he would feel more secure if public matters rested in other hands. The Grey Board voted 2-1 against him. The full commission, 4-1, revoked his clearance. He never worked on weapons again. He kept his post as director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He grew thinner. He smoked more. In 1963, in a small rehabilitation, President Johnson gave him the Enrico Fermi Award, the same award that the previous year had gone to Edward Teller. He died of throat cancer on February 18, 1967. He was 62. In December 2022, 55 years after his death, the United States Department of Energy formally vacated the 1954 decision. Secretary Jennifer Granholm's statement said the process had been flawed, that the Commission had not followed its own rules. By then, the men who had accused him were long gone. What remained was the work itself. He had brought theoretical physics to America. He had trained a generation of its physicists. He had stood in a desert and watched a piece of mathematics turn into a weapon. And he had spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that meant, for him, and for the country that, in the end, could neither keep him nor let him go. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe for more.